So I'm going to be sharing with you some of the best practices for structuring your design. And this is important as Locofy is going to read your structure in order to generate code, and you can get very different code based on how you have structured your design. So here are some of the best practices. The first best practice is to remove unnecessary groups or frames. Now, let me show you an example. Here you can see that we have this flexibility and options text, and it's actually wrapped in a bunch of groups over here. So these groups may not be very useful for your design. It's not actually serving much of a purpose. However, this is actually going to generate many additional lines of code. So what you want to do is that if the group is not actually doing anything like helping you to structure your elements, then what you can do is to remove these groups. So you can do so easily by right-clicking and clicking on ungroup. Or you can use the shortcut. On Mac, it would be Command Delete. So I'll just do that a couple of times. As you can see, our design had no changes, and we had managed to get rid of a couple of layers, which is going to improve our code. Next, you can also remove unnecessary frames. So similar to groups, you might have frames that are not performing much of a purpose over here. So we can also go ahead to remove these. Perfect. So there we go. That is the first best practice that we would like to share for structuring your design. Next is to use frames instead of groups. So why would we prefer to use frames instead of groups? Is because frames can actually do everything that groups can do and more. And in general, frames respond better when we are applying auto layout, which is useful when we want to add responsiveness. This is something we had covered in more detail in our previous webinar, which we were talking about responsiveness. So when you have groups and you want to convert them into frames, you can do so easily. So for example, we might want to put these two together. So I'm going to add a group. And here we can convert this group into a frame by simply clicking on group, change that to a frame. Alternatively, we can also, instead of grouping it from the start, we can just right click and frame the selection instead. So that is using groups instead of frames. Next, we also want to ensure that we frame up items according to the different sections. Now, you can see here in this design that we actually have our items strewn all around the place. So we have our individual items like this over here. Here as well, you can see these items are all individually placed. So what happens is that in the layer structure, you can see that it's a very flat structure with everything directly inside of the parents container. Now, what we'd like to do is to actually have them structured in a more organized fashion and apply some sort of hierarchy in our structure. This is going to be useful in code as well as in the design. So for example, we might want to deal with this section as a section. So what we can do is we can select all the elements here, including the image, and apply a frame around it. And that helps us to add some structure so we know, okay, this is a header section. So it helps you to organize in Figma, and inside of code, you will also get more well-structured code. This is useful, especially when you might want to reuse this as well in a different section. You can simply just copy that across, right? So here, I'll just quickly also go ahead and frame up a few of these other sections. So I'll simply click the frame tool and draw a frame around the elements. What this does is that it will place all of these elements directly inside of the frame that we had drawn around it. So we can do the same for these as well. Now, one thing to note when you are framing up your elements is that you might also want to look out for things which have been previously grouped or framed wrongly. Let me give you an example. For example, if I had previously had all of these elements in a group, so let me group them together. And I had made some, let's say I made some changes to this design. So for example, I no longer want this to be facts. I'm going to delete it. And I want this to instead be another phone number. So I will make a copy here. So what you notice is that this phone icon is actually going to be separate from our initial group that we had created. So you might not notice this at the start, but it's going to affect the layer structure. So when you are going about to frame up your items, do also be sure to check out the existing groups to make sure that you have them in the correct structure. So in this case, we are going to want to ungroup this and then group them together again as a frame. Great. So another thing is that we can go in further and we might realize that, hey, we want these items to be, separate from this logo over here. So we can actually also select these items and apply a frame to it. Great. So we can go into our design and start to frame up items according to different sections. They can be big sections like these, and it could be smaller sections like this as well. We can even break this into even smaller sections like this for even more structure. Now, this is also going to be useful for our next tip, which is to apply auto layout and responsiveness constraints. So let me show you over here. We have this design, and as we resize this frame, it is not going to be responsive. What we can do is we can apply auto layout. And now you can see that this is in auto layout. We can apply a responsiveness constraint to keep this gap responsive. So I'm going to apply this space between setting. What this does is that this gap here is going to be responding according to the size of the container. So now we have this responsive, which is also another reason why we had wanted to group this as one section to keep them on the right and group this as another, or just leave this by itself to keep this on the left. So what you notice is that if you have followed step 3 to frame up items accordingly to different sections, when you apply auto layout, it's going to be very easy. Now, one more tip when applying auto layout, you can start to apply them from inside out. So for example, we have this section here. If we apply auto layout directly, you can see that since they are placed as individual elements, auto layout is going to start to want to force them into either a column or a row. So what we can do instead is to start to apply auto layout from the inside out. So we might want this as a row. These two elements, I'll apply auto layout here. Then these two could also be auto layout as a row. Next, these two items. And then now when we apply auto layout to this outer section, you can see that it is working perfectly. So to learn more about how you can do responsiveness, you can see here, it's not fully responsive yet. I just need to add a couple of constraints like fill container. Similarly here. And you can see that we have our responsive design. And this is going to be accordingly reflected in the Locofy plugin. So let me bring that out. And open up the Locofy plugin. Here you'll notice that it's going to be equally responsive. Let me see what happened there. right? This should be fill container. All right, perfect. So to learn more about responsiveness and a few more details about how we managed to achieve this, you can check out our previous webinar. We are going to be dropping a link in the description right after this webinar.